Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those stories that starts with a total plot twist. You know, the kind where fate looks down at someone and goes, let's just see what happens if I flip this guy's whole life upside down. That's exactly what happened to Henri Matisse, a quiet French law clerk who thought he'd spend his life drafting contracts, not masterpieces. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and the time in the comments. It's always wild to see where everyone's listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.
It's 1889 and 20-year-old Henri Matisse lies in bed completely miserable. He's not in the throes of heartbreak or existential despair. No, he's recovering from appendicitis, which in the late 19th century could actually kill you. He's stuck in a small gray room in Beauharnais-en-Vermandois, northern France, with nothing to do but stare at the ceiling. His mother, Anna, hands him a small paint set to keep him occupied. Just something to pass the time, she probably says.
That simple act changes everything. The young man, who had spent years studying law in Paris and reluctantly returned home to clerk in a dusty provincial office, opens the paint box and starts smearing colour onto paper, and something happens. Later, Matisse will say it felt like a kind of paradise. His hands move slowly, awkwardly, but with each stroke he discovers that colours can talk, that red feels bold and alive, that blue hums like a lullaby, and that green somehow breathes. It's ironic, really. The future father of modern colour theory begins his journey in a room where all he can see is beige wallpaper and sickbed linen. But in his mind, a world is opening. When Matisse recovers, he doesn't go back to law. He doesn't even think twice. He tells his father, who, by the way, runs a seed and grain business, that he wants to be a painter. You can imagine the reaction. His father reportedly went pale and said something like, "You'll starve." And honestly, that was a pretty fair prediction at the time. But Matisse doesn't care. He leaves for Paris again, this time with a box of paints and a head full of impossible dreams. Paris in the 1890s isn't just a city, it's a fever dream. Streets are lit by gas lamps, horse-drawn carriages still rattle over cobblestones, and cafes are buzzing with arguments about poetry, politics, and the meaning of beauty. The art scene is exploding. You've got Impressionists painting shimmering light, symbolists chasing mystery, and traditional academies clutching their pearls over these madmen with brushes. Matisse arrives in this chaos like a tourist who brought the wrong map. He enrolls at the Académie Julian, where the teaching style is strict, hierarchical, and, well, kind of boring. Endless drawing from plaster casts, rigid anatomy studies, everything grayscale. He's supposed to master the rules before breaking them, but Henri can feel his soul drying up. He even jokes in a letter that the studio smells like dust and despair. One afternoon he sneaks out and visits the Louvre. Not the Renaissance wing, where everyone else is copying Raphael, but the corners filled with things people don't look at for long. Old textiles, Islamic ceramics, African sculptures. He's mesmerized. The colors and patterns hit him harder than any academic lecture ever could. Historians today still debate exactly when his fascination with decorative rhythm begins, but many trace it back to that very moment, wandering alone among forgotten treasures. There's also a delightful little myth, which scholars can't confirm but we want to believe, that early on Matisse tried to paint a bowl of fruit and got so frustrated with realism that he accidentally invented his first abstract still life. His teacher scolded him, of course, but Henri looked at the smudgy, colour-saturated mess and thought, maybe this isn't a mistake. By the mid-1890s, he's living cheap in Montparnasse, painting in tiny rooms with windows that barely open. Sometimes he can't afford canvases, so he paints over old ones or uses wallpaper as a substitute. His friends remember him as quiet but fiercely focused, often humming softly as he painted. He's not chasing fame, he's chasing a feeling. And that feeling, the pure emotional power of colour, is something no school can teach. It's funny, Matisse's early life looks, on paper, like a slow start. No big exhibitions, no rich patrons, just another struggling artist among thousands. But beneath that calm surface, his instincts are sharpening. The beige room from his sickbed days has turned into a kaleidoscope. He's beginning to see what others can't. That colour isn't decoration, it's emotion itself. Historians still debate when Matisse truly became Matisse. Some say it was the first time he mixed pure cadmium red with cobalt blue. Others claim it was when he realized that painting could feel like music. But one thing's clear, his story doesn't start with genius. It starts with boredom, a brush, and a very patient mother. And as the century turns, that small spark of discovery is about to burst into flames. By the time Matisse fully settles in Paris, the city itself feels like a living painting, half chaos, half romance, all inspiration. But here's the thing, every brushstroke of beauty in Paris hides a bureaucratic nightmare. Art schools, especially the prestigious ones, are less about creativity and more about proving you can follow rules without crying. Matisse, ever the quiet rebel, enrolls at the École des Beaux-Arts, the fortress of French artistic tradition. His teacher, Gustave Moreau, a symbolist painter known for mythological scenes dripping with symbolism and detail. At first, Matisse doesn't quite know what to make of him. Moreau seems like the kind of guy who could write a novel about a single flower. But soon Matisse realizes that beneath the eccentricity lies a revolutionary mentor. Moreau tells his students, "Don't imitate, create," and that sentence lodges itself somewhere deep in Matisse's mind, like a mantra he'll carry for life. Under Moreau's guidance, Matisse learns to look at art not as a mirror, but as a language. He starts sketching endlessly, faces, fabrics, fruits, anything that sits still long enough. He even paints late into the night, using oil lamps that flicker and distort colors. And that distortion? He loves it. The yellow light bends reality just enough to make it interesting. Still, Paris isn't exactly cheering him on. Critics dismiss his early work as clumsy, his brushwork unrefined. His classmates, many of whom dream of medals and commissions, find him too obsessed with colour, not serious enough. There's a popular rumour that one student said, "Matisse paints like a child," to which years later Matisse would respond, probably with a smirk, "Yes, but with the genius of one." Life in Paris is a test of endurance. Matisse survives on cheap bread, endless coffee, and the occasional generosity of his friends. His apartment walls are thin, and every night he can hear piano music, arguments, and laughter drifting through from the neighbouring rooms. The Montmartre district is teeming with painters, dreamers, poets, and pickpockets. It's where art and hunger share the same address. During this period, he meets Amélie Parère, a milliner's assistant who has both elegance and practicality in her bones. She's sharp, grounded, and unimpressed by artistic posturing. They marry in 1898, forming a partnership that will last through decades of triumph and turmoil. Amélie becomes his emotional anchor and occasionally his model. If Matisse is a storm of colours, she's the steady horizon that keeps him from drifting away. But Paris in the 1890s isn't just romantic garrets and café debates, it's a battleground of ideas. Impressionism, which had once shocked the world, is now mainstream. Post-Impressionists like Cézanne, Gauguin and Van Gogh are beginning to reshape the landscape entirely. Matisse visits exhibitions of their work and feels both awe and confusion. Cézanne's solid, geometric still lifes make him rethink space. Van Gogh's feverish energy makes him question sanity. Gauguin's use of pure, flat colour feels almost like rebellion. He starts experimenting, nervously at first, then boldly. He thickens his paint, exaggerates his hues, simplifies shapes. The academic teachers call it wrong. But something in him knows that wrong might actually be right. There's a lovely anecdote from this era. Once, Matisse brings home a bouquet of bright flowers, but instead of arranging them in a vase, he scatters them on the floor and paints them as they fell. That's how they looked happiest, he explains. That sentence sums him up perfectly. He's not interested in order, he's interested in feeling. Of course, the path of artistic enlightenment is rarely linear. Around 1899, Matisse hits a wall. His works aren't selling, and his father is still unimpressed. To stay afloat, he trades paintings for groceries, literally. There's even a story that a local butcher once received an early Matisse canvas as payment for meat. Imagine that hanging in your kitchen now. He finds comfort in friendship. A small circle of young painters, Albert Marquet, André Derain, Georges Rouault, becomes his creative family. They debate colours like philosophers and gossip about art dealers over cheap wine. They're not trying to fit in, they're trying to invent something that doesn't exist yet. Still, Matisse feels lost between worlds. He's too classical for the avant-garde and too experimental for the academies. He writes in his notes, "I am seeking an art of balance, of purity, of serenity." It sounds modest, but what he's really describing is a revolution in disguise. Then one afternoon, it happens again, the kind of moment that rewires a life. Matisse wanders into a small gallery and sees a painting by Claude Monet. It's Impression Sunrise. The colours shimmer, the brushstrokes breathe. Suddenly he understands. Painting isn't about reproducing what the eye sees. It's about what the heart feels when the eye sees it. He leaves the gallery in a daze, clutching his sketchbook like it's a secret weapon. That night he paints until dawn, chasing the ghost of light across his canvas. The world outside is changing, electric lamps replacing gaslight, automobiles rattling past carriages, and Matisse feels it all vibrating through his brush. Historians still argue whether Monet was truly his turning point, or if that story is a later romantic embellishment. But one thing is certain. From that night on, the rules stop mattering. The student of Paris is about to become something far more dangerous, a dreamer with purpose. There's a point in every artist's life when the world flips upside down, not with tragedy, but with clarity. For Matisse, that moment arrives in front of a Monet. It's a cold afternoon sometime around 1899. Paris is grey and impatient, the Seine swollen with rain. Matisse ducks into a small exhibition, more out of curiosity than purpose. He stands before a painting that looks nothing like what he's been taught to admire. The brushstrokes are loose, reckless even. The forms dissolve in light, and yet it feels more real than anything he's ever seen. The title, Impression, Sunrise. He stares for a long time, trying to make sense of it. It's not realism, it's not mythology, it's not moral instruction, it's something else entirely, something that breathes. Later, Matisse will say that seeing Monet's work was like suddenly understanding the language of light. He walks out into the Paris streets half-dazed, noticing for the first time that even puddles have colour, that shadows can be violet, that the city's grey is never truly grey. It's a cliché to say a man saw the world differently, but in this case, it's literal. At this stage, Matisse is still technically broke, still living in cramped quarters with Amélie and their young son Pierre, but his spirit's on fire. He begins painting like someone possessed, lighter, freer, more alive. Instead of trying to mimic life, he starts chasing what he feels about life. He spends long afternoons in the countryside outside Paris, sketching haystacks, sunlight, reflections on water. Every blade of grass has its own voice, he writes in a letter. That's not something they teach in art school. It's something you discover when you stop caring about grades. But this shift doesn't win him many friends. His old academic peers whisper that he's lost his discipline. His colours are too bright, his forms too simplified. One critic will later describe his palette as a box of fireworks gone off by accident. Matisse doesn't mind. For the first time, he feels free. Around this time, he also encounters the work of Paul Cézanne, and this is where his mind truly begins to bend. Cézanne's paintings don't shimmer like Monet's. They breathe structure. His mountains and apples seem carved from light and geometry. Matisse becomes obsessed. He buys a small Cézanne still life with money he doesn't really have, essentially choosing art over rent. That painting hangs in his studio for decades, and he'll call it a kind of compass. Cézanne teaches him that colour and form can balance like notes in a symphony. Monet had shown him emotion. Cézanne shows him architecture. Together, they give him a foundation for everything he'll build later. There's an anecdote, still debated by historians, that Matisse once tried to paint like Cézanne for a week. The result was, by all accounts, a disaster, but in failing he found his own rhythm. Paris itself is changing fast. The 1900 Exposition Universelle has turned the city into the glittering capital of modernity. Electric lights, early automobiles, exotic art from colonies around the world, it's sensory overload. Matisse visits the pavilions and finds himself transfixed by African masks and oceanic carvings. Their simplified forms and rhythmic patterns strike something primal in him. He doesn't yet know it, but these will become key influences later in his wild period. He's also meeting other artists who are asking the same questions. What if beauty isn't about accuracy? What if emotion has its own geometry? These late-night cafe conversations become electric, half philosophy, half comedy. They debate whether a red wall can make you feel heat. One of them, probably Derain, jokes, "Matisse, one day you'll paint with the sun itself." They all laugh, but the joke will soon come true. Back home, Matisse's studio is a laboratory of light. He paints the same still life again and again, changing only the colours. He experiments with using shadow as colour instead of black. He paints windows opening to blinding landscapes, just to see how the eye reacts. Every failed experiment brings him closer to something raw and new. Amélie supports him quietly, even as money gets tight. She sews hats, runs errands, keeps the chaos contained. Their home is small, but filled with warmth, fabrics, and flowers. She once said that Matisse could see the world through joy even when there was none around. And so, a few years into the new century, the law clerk turned painter, the student turned wanderer, stands on the edge of something huge. His colours are growing bolder, his patience thinner, his ideas sharper. Critics still mock him, dealers still ignore him, but in his heart there's this quiet certainty that art isn't about imitation, it's about liberation. Later, he'll describe that era as the time he began to paint with the eyes of the soul. It's the poetic kind of statement that drives historians nuts. Some call it mysticism, others call it marketing. But one thing's clear, it marks the end of studenthood. Henri Matisse is no longer learning how to see, he's learning how to feel in colour. By 1905, the art world in Paris is vibrating like a nervous violin string. Painters are abandoning realism, critics are sharpening their knives, and somewhere in Montmartre, Henri Matisse is mixing colours that look like they've escaped from a dream. That summer he travels south to Collioure, a fishing village near the Spanish border, with his friend André Derain. The Mediterranean light hits different there. It's brighter, harsher, almost unreal. The sky isn't blue, it's electric. The shadows aren't grey, they're orange, violet, green. Everything shines, Matisse writes to Amélie. Even the fish seem to swim in light instead of water. He and Derain spend weeks painting outdoors, the air thick with salt and laughter and turpentine. They work fast, letting instinct lead the way. Their canvases glow with pure, unmixed colour, violent reds, shocking yellows, unnatural blues. They're not painting what they see, they're painting what it feels like to see. When they return to Paris and exhibit their work in the 1905 Salon d'Automne, the reaction is nuclear. The public walks in expecting polite landscapes and portraits. Instead, they're ambushed by explosions of colour that look like joy and insanity in equal measure. Matisse's woman with a hat, a portrait of Amélie with a rainbow face, sits in the middle like a dare. One critic, Louis Vaucels, looks around the room at all these wild, untamed canvases and mutters, "Donatello among the wild beasts." Les Fauves, the name sticks. At first it's meant as an insult, but Matisse and his friends, Derain, Vlaminck, Marquet, decide to own it. They are wild beasts after all, in a world that wants them tame. The show becomes legend overnight. Some viewers laugh, others rage. One woman reportedly fainted, another said the colours burn the eyes. Matisse, calm as ever, just smiles. I simply wanted happiness to look the way it feels. The funny part is that despite all the outrage, Woman with a Hat sells, bought by the Steins, an American family who collect modern art like others collect secrets. Gertrude Stein, with her sharp wit and sharper eyes, becomes one of Matisse's biggest supporters. Her salon at 27 Rue de Fleurus becomes the beating heart of modernism, where Picasso, Matisse, and a dozen other geniuses gather to argue, flirt, and change art history over coffee. Gertrude's brother, Leo Stein, famously defends Woman with a Hat to a skeptical friend, saying, "You'll learn to like it, or at least you'll never forget it." And that's the thing about Matisse, whether you love him or hate him, you remember him. After the Fauves scandal, everything accelerates. Matisse becomes a kind of accidental celebrity, the calm centre of a colourful storm. He's not exactly rich, but his name is known. Collectors start visiting his studio, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of courage. One described the experience as like walking into sunlight after years underground. But not everyone's clapping. Many critics dismiss Fauvism as childish, even dangerous. A few claim it's the end of civilization. They always say that when something new appears. Matisse, unbothered, keeps painting. What I dream of, he writes, is an art of balance, of purity, of serenity. That line confuses people. Balance and serenity aren't exactly what you see in his blazing canvases. But to Matisse, it's not contradiction, it's the point. He believes chaos can be calm if the colours sing in harmony. Meanwhile, Derain takes Fauvism toward fiery landscapes. Vlaminck dives into emotional turmoil, and Matisse, always the quiet experimenter, turns inward. He begins simplifying forms, seeking clarity in the storm. His 1906 painting The Joy of Life becomes a manifesto. Flowing figures, bright fields, no shadows, no realism, just a universe built entirely from feeling. The academic critics lose their minds. These people paint like savages, one of them shouts in print. They use colour like a weapon, and you know what? They're not wrong. The wild beasts aren't attacking nature, they're liberating it. They're saying, reality is overrated. Emotion is enough. There's also a softer truth behind the noise. Fauvism, for Matisse, isn't just rebellion, it's healing. After years of financial strain and self-doubt, painting with such freedom feels like breathing again. The southern light, the sun on his skin, the laughter of his friends, it all folds into the paint. Amélie, who poses for many of his portraits, endures the wild colours with grace. Once, someone asked her if she minded being painted green and orange. She smiled and said, "It's better than being painted dull." Historians still argue about how long Fauvism lasted. Some say 2 years, others stretch it to 5. But the truth is, it wasn't a movement, it was a spark. A flash of freedom that set the 20th century ablaze. And when the dust settles, Matisse emerges not as just another Fauve, but as something rarer, the calmest wild beast of them all. It's somewhere around 1906 when Henri Matisse meets the man who will become both his mirror and his shadow, Pablo Picasso. They're introduced by Gertrude Stein, of course, because if there's one person in Paris who collects geniuses like others collect stamps, it's her. Picture it, a smoky evening at Stein's salon, the walls crowded with paintings, the air thick with cigarette smoke and arguments. Matisse, dressed neatly, calm, polite, radiates composure. Picasso, 10 years younger, short, intense, with eyes like burning coals, prowls around the room like a cat sizing up a rival. Gertrude, amused, probably sits back thinking, this is going to be fun. They talk, or rather spar. They compare ideas, laugh too loudly, maybe insult each other a little. They're opposites in almost everything. Matisse loves harmony and clarity. Picasso thrives on tension and chaos. Matisse builds calm, Picasso breaks it. But from that night on, they orbit each other for life. Historians call them friendly rivals, though the friendship part was sometimes up for debate. Picasso later joked, "All things considered, there's only Matisse." And Matisse once quipped, "Picasso is like a bandit, he steals everything. But he steals it brilliantly." They visited each other's studios often. Matisse's was bright and orderly, filled with fabrics, plants, and carefully arranged still lifes. Picasso's looked like an explosion of ideas. Paintings stacked on the floor, half-finished sculptures, chaos in every corner. One visitor said that going from one to the other was like travelling between heaven and a thunderstorm. And yet, despite their differences, they understood each other better than anyone else did. They both wanted to reinvent art, not by destroying the past, but by freeing it from imitation. Their conversations, if you could call them that, were legendary. Picasso would sketch a quick portrait of Matisse, sharp and teasing, and Matisse would respond by painting a serene figure that seemed to float above the chaos. It was like a long-running visual duel. They competed, yes, but they also pulled each other higher. When Picasso unveiled Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1907, Matisse was one of the first to see it. The painting shocked everyone. Those fractured, mask-like faces, the raw geometry, the unapologetic boldness. Legend has it that Matisse was both horrified and impressed. "So this is what he's been hiding," he might have muttered. Some say that the blue nude, which Matisse painted soon after, was his answer. It's a figure both sensual and unsettling, painted with the confidence of someone who's not afraid to stare back at Picasso's challenge. The art historians are still arguing about whether the blue nude was revenge, homage, or coincidence. Maybe it was all three. But let's not forget, while art historians love the rivalry, the two men genuinely respected each other. They'd send paintings as gifts, each trying to one-up the other in generosity and daring. Picasso once gave Matisse a small bronze sculpture of a goat. Matisse responded by giving him a paper cutout of a dove years later, a quiet symbol of peace between beasts. Their friendship survived wars, critics, and fashion. In letters, Matisse called Picasso the devil, but always with affection. When they argued like brothers. When they praised each other, it was usually in the most backhanded way possible. Outside their personal duel, Matisse's art is evolving again. Fauvism has burned bright and faded. Now he's refining. His studio becomes his universe, filled with Persian carpets, North African textiles, musical instruments, and plants. Everything becomes a study in rhythm and pattern. He paints The Red Room, Harmony in Red, in 1908, and it feels like stepping into another dimension. The walls, the table, the curtains all melt into one continuous red field, broken only by gentle patterns and glimpses of fruit. It's not a room, it's a feeling. Critics are bewildered. One asks, where is the perspective? Another complains, everything is flat. Matisse, ever serene, replies, it's not about the illusion of space, it's about the expression of colour. And just like that, he quietly moves beyond Fauvism into something new, something only he can define. Meanwhile, Picasso is diving into cubism, breaking forms apart like puzzles. Matisse watches with admiration and mild horror. He cuts things open, Matisse says, while I try to make them whole. The world, it seems, needs both kinds of vision. At this point, they've both become icons. Their names are whispered in galleries from Paris to New York. Dealers start selling their works for real money. Matisse, who once traded paintings for groceries, now has collectors bidding for his sketches. But the fame doesn't change him much. He still paints slowly, deliberately, chasing harmony in every line. There's a story from this time that always makes people smile. One evening, Matisse invites Picasso over for dinner. After dessert, Picasso walks up to one of Matisse's paintings and half-jokingly says, "It's beautiful, but I would have done it differently." Matisse just grins and answers, "That's why it's mine, not yours." It's the perfect summary of their friendship. Rivalry without malice, competition without hatred. Two men pushing the boundaries of what art could be, each in his own direction, yet somehow drawing power from the other. And through it all, Matisse remains the eye of the storm, measured, calm, and utterly certain that colour, not conflict, is the true revolution. The 1910s arrive like a wave of change, and Matisse, now in his early 40s, starts to drift away from the noisy energy of Paris. The Fauves have scattered, Picasso is busy reinventing geometry, the art world hums with experimentation, but Matisse, he's looking for quiet, he's tired of shock, he's chasing peace. And as always, when Matisse chases something, he paints it. In 1911 he travels to Morocco and the colours hit him like a second sunrise. The light there isn't soft like France, it's sharp, alive, buzzing with heat. The shadows are blue, the air hums and every wall seems to vibrate. Matisse wanders through the Medinas, sketchbook in hand, mesmerised by patterned tiles, white robes and the slow rhythm of daily life. He writes to a friend, "Everything here is bathed in light. Even silence has a colour." He paints Zora on the terrace and the Casbah Gate. These aren't travel postcards, they're meditations. The figures are calm, nearly still, surrounded by patterned fabrics and glowing air. Matisse isn't trying to capture Morocco, he's trying to capture the feeling of being there. It's as if his eyes have learned to breathe. When he returns to France, that Moroccan light follows him into his studio. The walls are now drenched in warmth. His models sit among exotic textiles and musical instruments. Everything becomes a part of the composition, the curtains, the furniture, even the air between things. He paints the music and the dance around this time, monumental works pulsing with rhythm and simplicity. The figures, naked, bold, painted in broad arcs of colour, feel ancient and modern at once. It's not a scene, it's a universe in motion. At first glance, they look simple, just lines and colour. But look longer and they start to hum like chords struck on a hidden instrument. This is what Matisse has been searching for, a visual music that doesn't shout but sings. Then 1914 arrives, and with it, the storm. World War I begins and the Europe Matisse knew starts to unravel. Many of his artist friends enlist or flee. Picasso stays in Paris, Matisse does too, but his world shrinks. Supplies are scarce, collectors vanish, and his bright studio light suddenly feels dimmer. He paints quietly through it all, portraits of his wife, still lifes, interiors where sunlight sneaks through the shutters. Gone are the violent reds and blues. In their place, a new calm emerges. Even his brushstrokes seem slower, as if each one is a breath against chaos. Art critics later call this his nice period because Matisse eventually moves to the south of France, to Nice, the city of endless sun. But it's more than geography. Nice becomes his refuge, his cocoon of clarity. In Nice, he finds what he's been seeking all along, serenity through colour. He sets up his studio in a modest hotel room. Outside, the Mediterranean shimmers. Inside, he arranges flowers, fabrics, and open windows. He paints women reading, reclining, dreaming, always surrounded by soft light and patterned cloth. These are not grand scenes, they're whispers. To some critics, it looks like he's gone soft. They want rebellion. He gives them rest. But Matisse shrugs. "What I dream of," he says, "is an art of balance, purity and serenity, something that offers rest to the mind like a good armchair." That quote gets teased endlessly. "Art as an armchair?" scoffed one journalist. But over time, people realized he wasn't being lazy. He was being radical in a different way. After decades of visual chaos, he was inventing the aesthetics of peace. By the 1920s, his canvases glow with warmth. Odalisque in red pants, seated woman with a parasol, the painter's family. Each one radiates a quiet rhythm. He paints like someone who has stopped fighting and started listening. Matisse himself changes too. His beard turns white, his movements slow, but his eyes, those calm, blue-grey eyes, seem to see through things now. He doesn't paint what he sees. He paints what remains after everything unnecessary has fallen away. There's a famous photo of him during this time, sitting in a white shirt, surrounded by plants and sunlight. He looks like a monk who swapped prayer beads for paintbrushes. One day, a journalist asks him if he ever misses the wildness of Fauvism, the fire, the rebellion, the beastly energy. Matisse smiles. "No," he says softly, "the beast has learned to purr." And in that single line he sums up his whole journey, from the roar of colour to the quiet hum of harmony. By the time the 1930s roll in, Matisse and Picasso have become something like art world planets, each orbiting the other, sometimes close enough to share light, sometimes flinging shadows. Their friendship is as famous as their rivalry, and honestly, it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. They meet often in Paris, usually in dim cafes where the smoke curls around them like question marks. Matisse, formal, patient, precise, sips his wine. Picasso, brash, restless, loud, gestures with both hands. They tease each other like brothers but duel like fencers. Someone once said, "Matisse paints happiness, Picasso paints drama." It's true, but only halfway. Matisse chooses peace, Picasso fights for it. The two men study each other's work obsessively. Picasso once quipped, "All things considered, there is only Matisse." Matisse, ever the gentleman, responded, "Only one painter truly understands me, Picasso." Which sounds sweet until you realize it's also a challenge. If Picasso invented cubism by breaking form apart, Matisse countered by keeping form whole but simplifying it until it glowed. Picasso deconstructed, Matisse distilled. Both wanted truth, just through opposite doors. At times it's almost comical. When Matisse paints the Red Studio, a dreamy space flooded with crimson, Picasso counters with sharp grey geometries. When Matisse paints a serene odalisque, Picasso paints a fragmented one, as if saying, "Let's see your piece survive this." And yet neither can stop looking at the other. Art historians love this rivalry. Some call it a dialogue in colour. Others say it's a decades-long staring contest. What's certain is this: without Picasso, Matisse might never have pushed so far toward simplicity. Without Matisse, Picasso might never have discovered elegance in chaos. During this period, Matisse's art grows lighter, literally. His palette becomes pastel, his outlines gentler. He paints women reading, musicians tuning instruments, rooms washed in sunlight. The war years are behind him, but Europe still trembles. And in response, Matisse paints calm like it's oxygen. One painting stands out, the Pink Nude, 1935. It's deceptively simple, a reclining figure against a pattern of bold curves. But if you look closely, you can feel the hundreds of sketches beneath it. Matisse redraws the same figure over and over, searching for that perfect balance between line and life. He once said, "An artist must possess the courage to eliminate, and the Pink Nude proves it. Nothing unnecessary remains." Meanwhile, his personal life is complicated. His marriage strains under the weight of his work and absences. His daughter, Marguerite, becomes his closest ally and confidant. She often poses for him, sometimes helps manage exhibitions, and during the coming war will risk her life for the French resistance. A story so dramatic it deserves its own film. Matisse rarely speaks of family in interviews, but in his drawings of Marguerite you can feel something sacred, a tenderness beyond colour. He paints her not as a muse, but as a moment of stillness. Then there's his health. In the late 1930s, his body begins to fail him. Intestinal surgeries, pain, exhaustion. He can't stand for long. Most painters would stop. Matisse adapts. He starts working from bed, arranging papers, cutting shapes, guiding assistants. The scissors become his new brush. This shift, this quiet act of reinvention, changes modern art forever. He calls it drawing with scissors. At first, it seems like a concession, but soon the cutouts evolve into something transcendent. Pure color, pure rhythm. Shapes float freely on white paper like notes on a score. They're not sketches for paintings. They are the paintings. One art critic later calls them the visual equivalent of jazz. Picasso visits Matisse often during these years. They talk for hours, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing. One afternoon, Picasso looks at a wall of Matisse's cutouts and says, "Henri, you've found a new way to paint without painting." Matisse smiles. "Yes," he says, "I've learned to paint with light itself." There's a long pause. Then Picasso, ever competitive, replies, "It's annoying that you're still inventing." The two men laugh, old lions sharing the same sunbeam. Art historians still debate who won this lifelong duel. Spoiler, no one did. Some argue Picasso changed form more radically. Others say Matisse reached deeper serenity. But most agree that their relationship was symbiotic, like fire and water shaping each other. A young art student once asked Matisse if he ever got tired of being compared to Picasso. He paused, then said, "No, because through him I see myself more clearly." And that's the quiet truth of it. Two geniuses holding up a mirror for each other, reflecting not rivalry, but recognition. The war comes again, and this time it's darker. France falls, Paris is occupied, and the art world goes underground. Matisse, frail but stubborn, stays in Nice. He's too ill to flee, too devoted to stop working. The sound of planes overhead replaces the chatter of cafes, but in his small apartment he begins a new chapter, one of colour, scissors and grace. By 1941, Matisse is recovering from major surgery. The doctors call it a miracle that he survives. He calls it a second life. But this new life comes with limitations. He can no longer stand to paint at an easel. So, from his bed, surrounded by papers and paints, he begins experimenting with something radically simple. He cuts. Assistants paint sheets of paper in vivid gouache, deep blues, lemon yellows, coral reds. Then, with long, deliberate snips, Matisse sculpts the air itself. Each cut is confident, almost musical. The shapes fall like petals, and he arranges them on the floor until they sing together. What began as therapy soon becomes revelation. He calls it painting with scissors, and though it sounds whimsical, the results are revolutionary. These aren't sketches or collages, they're symphonies of colour and rhythm. The cutouts, what critics later call his gouaches découpées, are both childlike and divine. His studio transforms into a garden of paper. Walls bloom with leaves, stars and dancers. Assistants move around like gardeners, pinning new shapes each day, while Matisse, seated in a wheelchair, directs with calm precision. Visitors are astonished. They expect a sick man and find a maestro conducting color. One of his assistants, Lydia Delektorskaya, recalls, he would hold the scissors like a violin bow, and each cut felt like music. That's how the sheaf, Blue Nude 2, and the snail come to life, vast arrangements of energy and grace. There's no pre-sketch, no hesitation, just movement, breath, and rhythm. It's hard not to see these cutouts as spiritual. After decades of painting, Matisse has arrived at pure essence, color without contour, form without struggle. Art historians still argue over whether these works are drawings, paintings, or something in between, but maybe that's the point. They exist beyond labels. Meanwhile, outside his window, the world burns. His daughter Marguerite is arrested by the Gestapo for helping the resistance. Tortured, nearly executed, she miraculously survives. Matisse never fully recovers from the emotional shock. He paints paper birds after her return, saying softly, "They are my thanks to freedom." There's something heartbreaking yet serene about those years. The frailty of his body contrasts with the youthfulness of his art. He seems to be growing younger as he grows weaker. "Old age," he tells a visitor, "has released me from the fear of perfection." Then comes his most ambitious project, the Chapel of the Rosary in Vence. In 1948, a Dominican nun named Sister Jacques Marie, who once served as his nurse, asks him to design a chapel. Not just the decorations, the whole thing. Windows, walls, vestments, even the chalices. Matisse, now in his late 70s, accepts. It becomes his obsession for 4 years. He designs stained glass windows that flood the space with blue and green light, like underwater sunlight. The white walls reflect it softly, and the entire chapel feels like one of his paintings made real. Critics are baffled. A modernist designing a Catholic chapel. But Matisse sees no contradiction. "What I have dreamed of," he says, "is an art that gives comfort, like a good armchair for the soul." When the chapel finally opens in 1951, it leaves people speechless. Even Picasso admits it's Matisse's masterpiece. In the final years, the paper cutouts become his language. He creates the blue nudes, those fluid silhouettes of women that seem to float in mid-air. They are simplified to the point of silence, and yet utterly alive. He works surrounded by color, sunlight, and laughter. Visitors describe his studio as a child's paradise designed by a sage. Birds chirp outside, jazz hums softly on the radio, and Matisse keeps cutting, rearranging, smiling. One journalist asks him if he ever gets bored. Matisse laughs. "How could I? Every color has something to say." By 1953, his hands tremble, but his eyes remain sharp. He looks at his walls, covered in living paper, and murmurs, "At last, I have found balance." And maybe he has. After all, the man who once painted wild beasts has learned to whisper in color. By the early 1950s, Matisse's world has narrowed to a single room, but what a room it is. The walls are alive with color, the air thick with light. Sheets of paper, blue, green, yellow, flutter in the breeze like butterflies that forgot to land. Assistants move around quietly, pinning and unpinning shapes. And in the middle of it all sits Matisse, a thin figure in a white shirt, eyes sharp as ever, scissors in hand. He can't walk without help now. But he smiles almost constantly, as if amused by his own fragility. "I'm like a bird in a cage," he tells a friend, "but I sing all the same." And what a song it is. By this time, Matisse's cutouts have reached their purest form, both joyful and profound. He's no longer chasing realism or impression. He's painting directly with light, rhythm, and memory. Every piece seems to float between earth and sky. The Snail, 1953, is one of his last great works, a spiral of colour blocks, orange, violet, green, ultramarine, arranged in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Some critics see a literal snail, others see a metaphor for time, or the circle of life. Matisse just calls it a snail smiling mischievously, but you can feel something eternal coiled inside it. He tells visitors, it's not a snail, it's the journey of the snail, which, when you think about it, might as well describe his entire career. By now, the art world has changed again. Abstract expressionism dominates New York. Pollock is flinging paint, Rothko is dissolving form. Critics wonder if Matisse, this gentle Frenchman with his scissors, is still relevant. But when jazz is published, his book of cut-out prints, the question answers itself. The book bursts with colour and energy, pairing vivid paper collages with poetic text. The title isn't random. Matisse compares his creative process to improvisation. Each cut, he says, is like a rhythm, a movement, a note of music. The result? A masterpiece that feels spontaneous yet deeply deliberate. The art world takes notice. Suddenly, this man in a wheelchair is influencing an entire generation of abstract painters. Mark Rothko, Ellsworth Kelly, Helen Frankenthaler. They all look to Matisse and see not a relic but a prophet of simplicity. Still, Matisse never becomes grand about it. He stays funny, human. One day, a young artist visits and gushes, "Monsieur Matisse, your work gives me such peace." Matisse grins. "That's good," he says, "because I've been chasing peace my whole life." He sketches constantly, even when his hands tremble. The lines grow looser, almost playful. His last self-portraits are little more than squiggles, and yet they're unmistakably him. A few bold lines, a flicker of humour, and that endless curiosity shining through. Sometimes he sits by the window, watching the Mediterranean light play across the room. "I've spent my whole life looking for this," he whispers, "the light that never leaves." In 1954, Matisse falls ill for the final time. He's 84. Lydia and Marguerite sit by his bedside. The walls of his room are still covered in paper cutouts, floating leaves, dancers, and stars. It's as if he's surrounded by his own universe. On one wall hangs the blue nude 4. He gazes at it for a long time. "There," he says softly, "I have finally found the line that rests." Those are some of his last recorded words. When news of his death spreads, Picasso is devastated. He paints a dove in his honor, simple, white, and calm. When Matisse died, Picasso later said, "He left me his odalisques, and I will never be able to do them justice." It's strange, two men who spent half a lifetime challenging each other end up speaking the same visual language of peace. Art historians still debate the legacy. Was Matisse a revolutionary or a decorator, a mystic or a hedonist? But those who stand before his paintings rarely care about the arguments. They just feel something quiet inside them loosen, a sense of balance, of colour breathing in harmony. One critic summed it up perfectly. Matisse taught us that beauty isn't escape, it's endurance. Today, his spirit lingers everywhere, in the clean lines of modern design, in the bold palettes of contemporary art, even in the patterns of everyday life. When you see a blue chair against a yellow wall and it feels just right, that's Matisse smiling somewhere. He once said, "There are always flowers for those who want to see them." And even now, decades later, he keeps proving it true. Today, his spirit lingers everywhere, in the clean lines of modern design, in the bold palettes of contemporary art, even in the patterns of everyday life. When you see a blue chair against a yellow wall and it feels just right, that's Matisse smiling somewhere, quietly approving the harmony he spent a lifetime chasing. Even in places where people don't realize his name, his influence hums along. In a scarf's playful print, the rhythm of a modern building, or the way sunlight spills across a floor. His work reminds us that color is not decoration, it is emotion, it is life, it is a small daily miracle. In these final reflections, it's worth slowing down. Matisse's journey from law student to revolutionary painter, from Fauvist firebrand to master of cutouts, teaches a profound lesson about the pursuit of joy, serenity, and clarity. He did not chase fame or fortune. He chased the feeling of life itself, distilled into color, line, and form. That pursuit made him immortal, not because he changed the world overnight, but because he left behind a universe where the ordinary is extraordinary. And now, as we pause and breathe, let the rhythm of his colors sink in. Imagine the soft curves of the snail, the glowing warmth of the red room, the serene blue of blue nude 4. Let them hum gently in your mind, like a lullaby composed in paint. Feel the calm that Matisse chased so relentlessly, and remember that it exists not just in museums, but in every carefully chosen shade, every playful shape, every quiet moment of your own life. Slowly the room grows still. The papers flutter softly in imagined breeze. The Mediterranean light warms your thoughts, and you can almost hear Matisse whisper, "There are always flowers for those who want to see them." And now, as your mind drifts toward rest, carry that vision with you, a world balanced, harmonious, and alive with color. Sleep well, and let the art of Henri Matisse color your dreams.